Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Erika van der Waal. She's Professor of Primatology at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. She is also Director of the Inkawu Vervet Project at the Mawana Game Reserve in South Africa, an experiment field site with a study population of over 200 wild vervet monkeys. And she's also a Branco Weiss Fellow of the Society in Science at the University of Zurich. She is interested in the evolution of primate social behaviors with a main focus on cultural transmission and cognition. So, Dr. van der Waal, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so let's see. It's very interesting that you study culture and cultural transmission in animals apart from humans, because I guess that most people, it must be somewhat difficult for them to think how other animals might also have culture. So, I've already talked about this with people like, for example, Dr. Robert Boyd and Dr. Peter Richardson, that is culture as a biological phenomenon. But could you tell us what is culture from that perspective?
So I like a definition that is very simple from a primatologist, Bill McGrew, who says that culture is the way we do things here. So just like why, for example, here in Switzerland, I eat with a fork and a knife, and if I go to Japan, someone will eat with chopsticks, and so it's a very simple definition. Of course, it relies on mechanism, and so there is a good definition from Fragazi and Perry, who are also primatologists, and they define tradition as a distinctive behavioral pattern shared by two or more individuals in a social unit, which persists over time, and that new practitioners acquire in part through socially aided learning. So it's quite complicated, but it just means that it's a behavior that individuals learn from other group members, and that is carried on over time. And so they define this as tradition, and then some primatologists think that you need multiple traditions to have a culture in a species. So that, for example, Whiten says that the matrix of tradition built by previous generation and inherited by social learning, this is what is culture. And so for me, I think that we can use tradition and culture in more or less similar way, because for me, a tradition is a behavior that is culturally transmitted. So I would say, why be so difficult with many definitions and just take culture as the way we do things here?
Right, and it's the way we do things, but of course it doesn't include all sorts of behaviors, let's say, because there are some behaviors that are not cultural, or that we do not study as culture. At a certain point there you refer to the fact that it has to correspond to a set of behaviors that get transmitted from one individual to another. So it is always a social phenomenon. It can't be a strictly individual thing, correct?
Yeah, so individuals can innovate, but for this new behavior to become cultural, it has to be transmitted to others and persist over time. But yeah, it can start with one individual, but it doesn't become a culture if no one picks it up. But you have some strange example in primatology. For example, there was in a captive group a chimpanzee who started to put a piece of grass in the ear in a group, and then others did the same, and you had a whole group of chimpanzee walking around with a piece of grass in the ear. So it doesn't have to be to have like a function. It can be really arbitrary behavior that is transmitted socially.
Yes, but it has a biological basis because it depends on other aspects of a particular species' psychology and behavior, starting perhaps from their sociality and the way they establish relationships among them, that is, individuals of a certain species, how they relate to one another, correct?
Yeah, so of course they have to observe each other to copy what another individual is doing, and if they have this ability, it means that on their daily life it's something important to learn from other group members. Otherwise, they wouldn't have this cognitive ability.
Okay, and what are the parts of cognition that we have to study in order to better understand how information gets transmitted from one individual to another and how it disseminates perhaps in a group of individuals of a particular species?
So for this, we try to understand so the mechanism, like what do they copy, and there are plenty definition of different social learning mechanisms, but it can be very simple, like just being attracted to an area like where there is new food and then discover this food just because others are going there, to very high level social learning mechanisms that are like imitation or emulation, where they really copy the action in details or they copy the end goal of an individual, and it's often very hard to really know which precise mechanism is involved. And I prefer to see it as a continuum of like low level mechanism to high level ones, and but there might be multiple mechanisms as they are currently defined involved when in a social learning event.
Yes, but I mean, when I talk with cultural evolutionists, particularly the ones that do work on humans, they usually tell us about certain communicative biases that we have, and biases in terms of retaining information and looking to other people to obtain information. Like, for example, we have certain biases to get information from people who are of higher status and from our parents and from people of our own gender that are older than we are, and perhaps also certain biases related to the frequency of certain types of information. Like, for example, if certain types of information are very widespread in the population, if they are very popular, we also tend to acquire them. So do we also get those sorts of biases in other primates apart from humans?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So at the start, I was very interested in the question, do they learn socially? But the more and more with my experiment, I realized that I'm actually more interested in why and when and from who. So more the function. And it really seems that that depending who we in my experiment I train as a model, the knowledge will spread or not. For example. And so the first experiment I designed for my PhD, that where I wanted really to test the mechanism, actually I did the box wrong. I couldn't test anything of the mechanism, but I had, interestingly, in some group the boldest individual was the dominant female, and in some group it was a dominant male. And so then I saw that actually they copied the site to open demonstrated only when it was the dominant female, which in the species that I'm studying, vervet monkeys, it makes sense because the females are the philopatric sex. So they are the ones that stay their whole life within their group, and so they know more about feeding resources. And so as all our experiment, we need to put food inside for the monkeys to come and manipulate. It's normal that the monkeys thought, okay, it's about eating, then the females know best what to do. And then we did some other experiment to try to see if rank had a big influence, because in some species high-ranking individuals are more copied, but it didn't seem to be the case for vervet monkeys. But there are some examples in chimpanzee where it might be important there. So it really seems to vary from one species to another. But then concerning frequency, it's very hard to test in field experiment if it's really frequency that changed the behavior. So I've done one experiment with colored food where I trained the whole group to prefer pink or blue corn, and then I could test the next generation of infants, and they all learned the norm, because then the food was both tasting the same of which color to eat. But this can just rely by the fact that if they copy their mother, they were learning this, so nothing to do with the fact the whole group was eating. But then we had male dispersing across our groups, and they adapted to the new the color of their new group. Even if they had learned that the blue tasted really bad, we put bitter aloe in the color to train them. They enter a group and directly they see everyone eating blue, and they say, "Oh, okay, here we eat blue." And so here for us, we define it as conformity, but by conformity of abandoning your own preference for the one of the group. But then we don't know if they really copy the majority of individuals, what most evolutionary biologists or psychologists will say that is really a conformity, or if they copy the number of action, because also more individuals were eating. So it's very hard to disentangle with field experiment if it's a proper frequency bias. But then for the content bias, we've just done an experiment. We wanted to see if, so we found this preference for copying females in vervet monkeys, but wanted to know now, okay, if the dominant male gets 5 times more food out of the same box on the other side than the dominant female, will they then go over the fact of copying females, because there is this payoff bias. And what was interesting is that we found that males would copy the dominant male and go to the side with more reward, but that females will be totally conservative and carry on copying the female side, even if in this context it wasn't the good strategy, because they would get less food out of it. So it seems to be really complex, that multiple social learning rules are interacting one with each other, and really depending on the ecology of the species and the context, and then they will follow one or the other.
Mm-hmm. And you were just referring to content biases. Is it the case that other species also tend to pay more attention to the behaviors that others are exhibiting if they are related to certain evolutionary relevant problems that they have to solve, like getting food or mating or something like that? And perhaps if someone is doing something that is not really relevant to solve any of those problems, perhaps they ignore them more easily. Does that happen?
Yeah, so the experiment we managed to do nearly all involve food, because otherwise they don't participate. So that's something, a bias that we are introducing as researcher, because it's really hard to otherwise get them to do something and to do an experimental setup. And so I guess there we are introducing a big bias. But what we try also to look at is natural variation in behavior between neighboring groups. So I'm studying 6 groups of the same population, and at the moment we are just gathering more and more data to really try to see if they do things differently for really arbitrary behavior, like the way they call or the gesture they do when they groom each other. And so not only related to food, but also the way juveniles play, or like all social behavior, to see if we find differences on that level. And then I guess it would be even more important for their social life, like to behave socially in a similar way than to choose the exact same food or to manipulate the food in the same way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what are some of the most prominent models of primates where we've already studied culture and cultural transmission? I mean, people tend to focus perhaps a lot on the great apes because they are the ones that are the closest to us. That is the gorilla, the orangutan, the chimpanzee, and the bonobo. But you also talk about vervet monkeys. So, what are the species where we've already found culture?
Yeah, so it all started with a study on chimpanzee, where Andy Whiten like asked all the big research site, long-term research site, to if they wanted to collaborate to try to see the differences across those population, and they found really a lot of behavior, over 30 that were different and didn't seem easily explained just by the ecology or by genetics. And then later on, other researchers have done it on orangutans, then on spider monkeys. They have been also shown, and then recently on gorillas. And then for monkeys, capuchin monkeys, they also listed a lot of behavioral variation across groups. And I've recently tried to tackle this question on vervet monkeys, but of course, to really know if a behavior is cultural, then ideally you would need different generations, and that the behavior is kept, so that it's not just linked to the group composition of the moment, which could also influence a behavior. And then what is good with our site is that the groups overlap with each other. And so the ecology is very similar, because some of the examples of the chimpanzee where they thought it was cultural, and actually it was just due to the fact, for example, that some ant species were more aggressive than others, so the lengths of the grass they were using to get them were not cultural. They were just actually functional, to avoid being beaten by the ants. So it's very hard to totally rule out the ecology. So that's why we also take the approach of doing experiments, because then of course you can control the factors and really try to see if so now we know they have the abilities to learn socially very well, the vervets, but we still have to understand how do they really use it in their daily life.
Mm-hmm. And is it easy to establish a biological continuity between species of primates? That is, for example, we have our evolutionary branch, let's say, and we know that there are species of primates that diverged from it earlier in evolutionary history and others later, and that are closer to us. Is it the case that we tend to find that species which diverged earlier tend to have less cognitive tools to create culture, and perhaps the closest to us have more of those tools, or not really that way?
I think it's still a field where we need to discover a lot, and it seems that the great apes, especially the chimpanzee, have really a larger array of behavioral variant that could be cultural than other species, so which tend to make sense. But then it also seemed to differ quite a bit with the social structure of the group, and in groups where individuals are tolerated really close, like in capuchins, you also see that a quite small brain New World monkey also has a lot of cultural variation across groups. So it doesn't seem to be only the size of the brain and being closely related to humans that has an impact, but also the social unit, and all the primates have been also evolving since the time they split off from the human ancestor. So depending on their environment, they were also pushed maybe to develop more skills to learn socially from each other.
Okay, so when we are trying to establish a comparison between humans and other primates, perhaps we have to look to certain types of primates when studying certain specific traits, and to others to study others, because I mean we have differences and similarities with chimpanzees, gorillas, and even other more distant primates, right? So we have to go step by step and case by case when comparing ourselves with other primates, right?
Yes, so we can, like, ideally we would study all primate species and then see the difference and similarities, but as it's not possible logistically, then focus on some depending on the question. Like, for example, a good example is like when individuals are interested in cooperative breeding, then actually marmosets, who are really far from us, from South America, they're a great example of biparental care. Like, they always get twins, and then the male, there is only one male that reproduces in the group and one female, and they both will carry an infant, and they are very tolerant, and there is a lot of social learning also going on in such a species. So then it's really linked to the question that we are looking.
Right. And since one of the aspects that you referred to that is really important for individuals of a certain species to be able to develop and acquire culture is that they are able to learn from others, is it the case that in all species that show some sort of cultural behavior, they have to have a theory of mind developed at least to a certain extent, even though it is not as evolved as it is in humans, for example?
That's a good question, and I think we still don't really know it. It also depends again on the definition that we give of theory of mind. And for example, I did find what is defined imitation in some captive vervets, where we gave them a task of a little tube that had to be open, and we trained the individuals to open it with the hands or with the mouse, and then they copied this. And then so that from the literature is something that is requires high cognitive abilities, but then at the same time neuroscientists will say that there are some mirror neurons that makes you imitate without really realizing. And I have young children, and they will very quickly imitate you when you do different facial expressions, and I don't think that they are aware of who they are yet and what they are doing. So I think there are really different levels. And so, of course, if we think of emulation, so really goal-orientated copying, like that you want to achieve the same goal as someone else, then that might be very cognitively demanding. But to imitate body action might be actually something very innate, and that occurs without realizing that you're doing it. And even through simple social learning mechanism, you can get a group to behave all in the same way. So I don't think that you really need theory of mind to be able to keep on a tradition in a group. But then if tradition keep on the long run, they also need to be effective and useful, because otherwise they get lost. And I guess that's why the species that show really long-term traditions are the ones that tend to have larger brains, because then they can innovate important behavior, and that are kept on over time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, perhaps this is a bit of an anthropomorphic approach when we think that as we do other species, for them to be able to imitate one another and things like that, they would have to be able to think about what is in the mind of the other individual and perhaps to try to predict their behavior and their intentions and things like that. But what you're saying is that perhaps that might not be strictly necessary. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And for example, there is a paper who recently came out about mating conformity in fruit flies. And so, like, it seems that even very small insects could have the ability of choosing the same as what the majority of others are choosing. That was the color of the mating partner. And so, yeah, it seems that some mechanism of learning socially are there since a very long time, and I think in all group living animals, it might be really important to learn from others for their survival, and that might really not require very high cognitive abilities.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's interesting because I've already had a couple of conversations with people who do work in embodied cognition, and they also refer to the example of ants that they seem to have very complex social behaviors, but then when we really look into it, they're just following concentrations of pheromones in the air or something like that, and they create very complex behaviors out of patterns that they are not really conscious of what they're doing, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, we always think of the way that we are dealing with learning socially with the fact that we think about what the other are doing and is it a good thing or not, but there might be very different ways for other animals to solve the same problems.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, and are there any primate species where we've already encountered teaching behavior? That is, an individual, for example, an older individual intentionally teaching another one how to do something?
So there are some anecdotes, for example, of chimpanzee like taking the hand of a young one, like while cracking nuts. But it stays really rare. Most of the time, it's just allowing others to observe closely or to use the tools, like to let them use the same anvil and the same stone for the nuts cracking, for example. And I think that the best example of teaching is still out of primates, and it stays with meerkats, where they eat scorpions, which can be, of course, very dangerous for the individual eating it. And so apparently the young ones are begging for food, and so the adults that will provide, either the parents or helpers, they have a very interesting cooperative breeding society. They will bring a prey to the pups and slowly bring them live prey, but at different stage. So they will remove the dangerous tail at the start and slowly introduce them until the full scorpion. And so, apparently they really know which young is at what stage and will bring the correct the prey with the correct dangerosity at the good time. So there, for me, that's really an example of teaching, because it's really adapting to the level of the learner. Whereas in primates, I just know about those examples, and otherwise it's like, for example, I never saw a vervet monkey, like in one of my experiment, a mother showing to her offspring that's how to do, like taking the hands or something, or if the children was trying to eat the wrong, like the other color of food, the mother would not remove the hand, like would let the young one try. I guess it might be different with like poisonous species, but interestingly, it seems that for the wild food, the infant really just try what the mother or the other group members are eating, and so they won't try a new species on their own. And I think with our experimental setup, it's a bit different because we provide a lot of food right in front of them. And so then they dare to try our human food. But for the wild food, they really seem to learn it over their first year by just eating what their mother is and staying always in proximity.
Okay, so in other primate species, when we find certain individuals learning from others, it is from their own initiative that they observe others' behaviors and try to perhaps copy them, to imitate them, to emulate them, and to try them by themselves. Is that it?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think a big difference of human is the fact that we actively teach and the fact that we do it through language. And I think this really made a big step in our abilities to learn socially, and that it get to the scope of cumulative culture that always gets more and more complex from one generation to another.
Yes, that's interesting because there aren't really any other primate species that have language, right? Some of them, they have communicative calls, but that's not really language, right?
So they have many distinctive calls that they use in different contexts. For example, the vervets that I'm studying are very well known for their alarm calling behavior. And so if they do a snake alarm call, they will all stand up and first look at the caller to see where the caller is looking, to know where the snake is. And all stand still. But if one is calling for eagle, they will all run for cover, like go down the tree if they're on the top, or like run inside the bush if they were in an open area. So they really have calls that have a meaning and that they really know how to use. And it's nice to see juveniles because they will do an alarm call for raptor even when it's a bird that is really not dangerous, like an ibis flying by. When they are so the reaction of being scared and calling seems to be quite innate, but then they have to learn to which species they have to to do it or not. And so we've done some interesting experiments there with fake predators and changing the audience next to a juvenile. And so if there is the mother next, then they will not call. They will observe their mother and see if they have to call or not. But if they are on their own or with other juveniles, they will be always scared of the model, even if it's not a dangerous bird. But they will call just because they are not sure, and so they have no one to refer to learn if it's a dangerous thing or not. But then they have calls also to greet each others, and they have calls when they get lost, and they have calls around aggressive behavior when they aggress or when they are victims, and these calls can vary a bit, but they don't like combine many calls. So there are some examples of species of primate combining two calls to say like the type of predator and if it's close by or not. That's what researchers thought that was the meaning of it. But they don't do like sentences like we do. They don't like bond through talking to each other. It's really, for me, instead of talking to someone saying, "Hi, how are you?" what they do is they will approach and start grooming. Grooming is really the way they do social bonds. And I think we have changed this to talking, which has maybe some benefit and some disadvantages as well.
Right, that's very interesting. And at a certain point there you refer to the fact that there are certain primate species that sort of have to learn which animals they should fear. And wouldn't a good example of that be the one that comes from chimpanzees, I think, where they seem to have an innate predisposition to fear snakes, but they only show a fearful reaction to them after they've seen another individual, for example, looking at the snake and also having that fearful reaction. Isn't that another good example?
Yeah, that's another good example. And also in chimpanzee, there are some nice experiment where a chimpanzee on its own that has seen a snake will not call, and they will call only when another chimp who is naive and hasn't seen the snake is approaching. So really knowing who knows that there is a snake or not. So yeah, there are some really good examples that it's really to communicate to others that they won't do it if it's not needed to call.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've already referred to, during the interview, to a lot of behaviors coming from vervet monkeys, but since it is one of the primates that you're most interested in, could you tell us what are the sorts of behaviors that you study the most in vervet monkeys?
So I'm doing field experiments, which is still something a bit rare in primatology. So most people do experiments in captivity and do observations in the field. And then if they do experiment in the field, it's often playback, so playing back a call or bringing a fake predator. But there are little field sites where we are able to bring them food and manipulate things with food. And so that's why I've chosen to work on vervet monkeys, is because they're considered as a pest species in South Africa, which means that they are they're not endangered like most other primates. And so we get ethical permission to manipulate a bit more their behavior than what we could do on other species. And so they are small old world monkeys, so from Africa and Asia. They are the same family than baboons or macaques. And they are quite small for primates, so it's like 4 kilos for a female, 6 kilos for a male, so like a big cat. And they have social groups that are, for me, really interesting, because like in primates you have all types of social units. You have some species where it's just a couple with their offspring, some where it's like a harem, but in vervet monkeys it's a nice mixed social unit. So it's based around the matriline, so it's a mother and their offsprings. And then males, when they reach sexual maturity, they will disperse to other groups. But they do this multiple times throughout their life. So they don't do just one dispersal. They do really many dispersal. And also males tolerate each other within the same group. So in a group you have multiple adult males, adult females, and juveniles, which means that to see information transfer, it's really a big group with all kind of individuals to see who they learn from and who is more going with individual learning and who is learning socially more. And then the group size can really vary. At my field site, we have some groups that are over 50 individuals, and then the smaller unit have 4 individuals. It's a group that actually split off when a group becomes really too big for the resource. Then there are smaller units that fission out of it and try to start their own group, and some of them survive, so some don't. And so I do different field experiments, mainly on the topic of cognition and social learning with the vervet monkeys.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you say that you do field experiments, and also that you refer to the fact that perhaps in primatology that is not really prevalent, because isn't it also the case that we have to take into account that if we're studying animals in their natural environments, perhaps there they will exhibit some behaviors that we will not get exactly the same in the laboratory?
Yes, and I think that's part of the start of all my research is like, do we really know anything about cognitive abilities of primates? Because like those three chimpanzees that are in a lab or in a zoo and have been tested on hundreds of experiments, like, are they really the average chimpanzee? And so I'm also doing some experiments, both in sanctuaries in South Africa with captive vervets, and to really compare them to the wild population. And I think that captive one do exhibit, in most cases, higher cognitive abilities. And it might just be due to the fact that they have a bit nothing else to do than to watch what, like for social learning, than to look at what others are doing and to try to play with the same little box or then that we are offering. And in the wild, and of course they have to find their food. We are bringing in food, but it's not, it's really very small reward that we put in our experiment. They cannot live out of the food that we are bringing. And they have to be aware of predators, and they have to move around their home range, defend for neighbors. So they have plenty of other things to do. And so I'm currently doing some experiment where I'm trying to bring touchscreen technology to the field, and to use also the same touchscreens with captive vervets. And I'm really interested to see, because my prediction would be that for the basic cognitive tasks that we will run, that captive one should be better, like just that associative learning and reversal learning. But then we also want to do some tasks that are more linked to social cognition. And there I would expect, depending on the question, that the wild ones would be better, because they are in their natural group and that is stable over time, compared to the captive one in sanctuaries. It's like individuals are brought in and out, and they don't have like really the links, the natural links that the other ones have in the wild. So I really want to understand, like, what abilities do wild ones perform better in, and which one, like most of them, I guess the captive one will be better, but for some tasks I expect the wild ones to be better.
Mm-hmm. And particularly for the ones that we study in the lab, isn't it also the case that for us to obtain certain behaviors from them, we have to condition them to perform certain tasks, and then by doing so throughout a long period of time, that perhaps they get certain parts of their cognition overstimulated in comparison with their natural counterparts, let's say, and perhaps they would develop them more than the ones that live in the wild, for example.
Yeah, I think this is totally possible, but very hard to really test if it's the case of not. But for sure, they have more opportunities and more time to reflect on a task than the wild ones.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and since we're talking about vervet monkeys now, I would like to ask you a specific question about a paper that you published back in 2010 with the title "Selective Attention to Philopatric Models Causes Directed Social Learning in Wild Vervet Monkeys." So, in this case, what did you study exactly? And first, before we really get into the study, could you explain the concept of male and female philopatry, what it is about, really?
So philopatry is the fact that one sex, or both, but usually one sex of the species stays in the group where it was born. and that the other sex disperse. And this is a mechanism to avoid inbreeding in most primate species. And in vervet monkeys, it's the female who stay in their natal group, and the males will disperse when they reach sexual maturity. But for example, if you take a chimpanzee group, then it's the opposite. It's male who will stay always in the group where they were born, and females who disperse. So, in our case, the females are the ones that stay.
Okay, and so in the case of vervet monkeys, they have female philopatry. In what ways does that change the ways by which males and females acquire information or learn from the members of their own sex and the ones of the opposite sex?
Yeah, so in this experiment that you're referring in the paper, so we had the little box that had a white end and a black end to be easily distinguished from all the monkeys observing the model. So we chose one model per group that we trained, and we didn't really choose. We just let the one that is monopolizing it, because we are like, if you do it in captivity, of course you can isolate a group member and train it to the task. We cannot, so we just bring the task to the field and see which monkey is coming repeatedly and trying to monopolize it. And so then we developed some boxes now that we can control with remote control. But at the time of this paper, it was just we blocked one end of the box, and so that the dominant female who was always coming, she could always open from the white side, for example. And then we let that individual first figure out how to open. So we go step by step. So if it's a sliding door, it's first totally opened, then slowly closed. And then once the monkey is doing the correct movement, we let it demonstrate. I think in the case of that experiment, was it 25 times or 50? Depending on the experiment, we do different numbers of demonstration. But the aim is to have at least 2/3 of the group observing the task before we offer multiple boxes with both sides unlocked, and then we want to see do they copy the side demonstrated or not. In the case of that experiment, we had in 3 groups, it was the dominant female showing the task, and in 3 groups it was dominant males. And in the groups with the dominant females, they did copy the side to open, and in the group with dominant males, they went randomly to one side or another. And there were also, we had less participants going, so they seemed to be less interested in the task. And so that's when we developed this theory that maybe the fact that the model is a females, it's really more important for the group because it's females who know more about resource and the home range, and they might be a preferred model for a feeding task in vervet monkeys.
Mm-hmm. So we get some sort of social conformity there that comes from the females because they are part of the same group throughout their entire lives, and males from other groups arrive there, and when they do so, I mean the ones that have the information about perhaps the resources and other types of issues about the place where they live, it is retained by the females. Is that so?
Yeah, so that's what the theory that we are developing. And so now we have 8 years of data at the Inkawu Vervet Project of males tenure within groups, and they seem on average to stay less than a year in a group. So which means that they really move a lot around. So of course, every time they need the flexibility to integrate new groups and to learn where to forage and where to pay attention for predators and stuff in their new home range. Whereas females, they seem to be the one that know how the things are done in the group and will pass it on from one generation to the next. And that's what also came out of the experiment that was very similar to the one I just described, where this time we manipulate the reward with males getting 5 times more food out of the same box than the dominant female. And there we saw that the females of the group were still conservative and copying the female, even if in the short term, in this experiment, it was not the good strategy. But for them, maybe it's a lot more important to keep their bonds with other females and to behave like other females. Whereas the males in this experiment did manage to copy the successful dominant male who was getting 5 times more payoff out of this experiment, and that might reflect really the flexibility that males need in this species to change groups so often and to integrate different environment and also different social units.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just one last question. To be able to successfully develop and transmit culture in a particular species, does it matter if the individuals of that species tend to be more tolerant to one another, or if they tend to be more competitive or cooperative among them? Does that matter?
I think it should matter. I think we still don't have enough experiment done on many species that are really similar experiments to properly answer the question. But from what we know, at least from observations of different species, is that the species that are more tolerant, there are more opportunities to observe in details what others are doing, and that's why many examples of social learning also come from within the family unit, with infants copying their mother, because the mother will let the infant be on the mother or really close by when the mother is doing something. And then of course there is plenty opportunity for what we call peering, so looking in details into a behavior. And then in species where individuals are less tolerant, then maybe it's just when the infants can learn from their mother, but then later on it's harder to learn from other group members. But if we want to see the kind of horizontal transmission, so learning from others of the same age or younger even, and unrelated individuals, then it's really important that individuals can observe others, so that the group is quite cohesive and that there are opportunities to see what others are doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Van de Waal, just before we go, are there any good places on the internet if people want to learn a little bit more about your work?
So there is a website of the University of Lausanne with a page on my research group, like a Van de Waal group. If you type this in, you will find it. And otherwise, there is a lovely website done by a previous PhD student of mine about the Inkawu Vervet Project that can also be found online.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the video. And so, Dr. Van de Waal, thank you a lot again for taking the time to come on the show. It was a really interesting conversation.
With pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Hi guys, thank you a lot for watching this interview until the end. I'm recording a new ending just to let you know a couple of new things, but I mean, I've started this channel in February 2018 and I've been putting out a lot of interviews with academics and intellectuals. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And if you don't like Patreon or prefer other platforms, you can also go to PayPal and subscribe from $1 to $20. I have all of those options in the description box of the video. And you can also make a one-time donation on PayPal. And also you can go to Subscribe Star and pledge any amount there, so you have all of those options to support the channel. And so before I go, I would like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, and I'm very proud of this, my first producer, Isar Webb. Thank you for all.